I'm Edith Wembley, 72 years old, and 4 days ago I boarded a cruise ship with my son and daughter-in-law after 4 years of silence from them. I wanted to believe the invitation meant things had changed, that maybe Darren remembered the mother who raised him, taught him to read, held his hand when the fever wouldn't break. I hadn't seen his face since before the pandemic, hadn't heard his voice since the last holiday he skipped with no explanation. When the envelope slid under my door, it had no note, just a printed message that said, "Pack warm boat leaves Friday at 10:00 a.m. And even though I stood alone in my kitchen with a mug of tea gone cold and toast untouched, part of me still hoped that this was his way of coming back before we go any further. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever been invited somewhere only to question why you said yes. My name is Edith. I've lived in Frederick, Maryland for most of my life. Raised 3 kids in the same 2-story house, I ran a small used bookstore on the corner of East and 6th for over 30 years. Even after my husband Richard passed, I kept the doors open, hosted poetry nights for the seniors, and taught free reading classes at the library 2 nights a week. I wasn't wealthy in dollars, but I had enough. The mortgage was paid off. The roof had held through 2 hurricanes, and I had a garden full of tomatoes that still came in every summer. But none of that seemed to matter to Darren anymore. After he married Leanna, we spoke less, and when the calls stopped altogether, I tried not to ask too many questions. I don't remember the last time he looked at me with anything other than polite distance, so when I stepped onto that pier in Annapolis with my bag packed and scarf knotted tight against the wind, I braced myself. Darren stood near the gangway, smiling like it hadn't been years. Leanna stood beside him, her nails painted soft pink, her sunglasses perched too neatly on her head. She gave me a hug, like I was someone else's aunt. Not the woman who baked her wedding cake in our own kitchen. But the cabin they prepared for me was beautiful. Soft blankets, a bookshelf filled with my favorite titles, a framed picture of me and Darren from years ago on a trip to the mountains. It felt like they'd gone out of their way to make it personal, like someone had remembered the little things that first dinner. We sat by candlelight with music playing low. Leanna poured me a cup of chamomile before I could reach for water, and Darren cut my salmon into neat bites, like I was fragile. They asked about the bookstore, my volunteer work, my monthly book club. They nodded, laughed, even listened or pretended to. Part of me didn't want to believe it was all for show. I wanted to think maybe this was their way of reconnecting, and yet somewhere beneath the warmth and music, something pulled at me, a thin, sharp thread that tugged every time Darren looked down at his phone, or Leanna offered me another sip of tea on the second night as the wind shifted and the water outside turned glassy. Still, I felt something change. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It pressed in around me like something unsaid hanging too heavy in the air. That second evening on the ship began quietly. The sun had set early, casting long shadows across the water, and I remember standing by the window of my cabin, brushing my hand over the edge of the small bookshelf. I hadn't brought much with me, just a few paperbacks, a scarf, and a sweater that still smelled faintly of my laundry detergent back home. My body felt heavier than usual, not sore exactly, just sluggish. I tried to blame it on the sway of the ship or a poor night's sleep, but the pressure in my chest lingered even after I walked a few laps around the deck. That night, dinner was served in a smaller dining room near the back of the ship. It was quieter there, more intimate. Darren wasn't around, but Leanna was already seated when I arrived. She stood quickly, guided me to a table by the window, and handed me a mug before I could ask for anything. She said it was a herbal blend she'd found in Charleston, something she used when she felt tense. It smelled faintly of mint, and something else I didn't recognize. Something that reminded me of wet bark or old leaves. I took a few sips, more out of politeness than interest. Within minutes, my head began to feel strange, not dizzy, not just distant like my thoughts were passing through a layer of cotton. Liana smiled as she talked, asking about my reading nights if I was still baking those little lemon bars for the volunteers. Her voice was soft, steady. She reached across the table at one point and tucked a napkin into the side of my plate like I was a child at someone else's dinner table. When she asked about my blood pressure medication, I hesitated. I said yes, still the same little blue pills once a day. She nodded, typing something on her phone before folding it neatly back into her purse. The moment passed quickly, but something about it stayed with me. After the meal, we went up to the observation deck. The breeze cleared my head a bit, but I still felt that weight in my legs, like my steps didn't quite belong to me. Darren met us on the upper level and handed me a glass of lemonade. I took a sip, then paused. It wasn't bad, but it didn't taste right. I set it aside, asking for water instead. Liana reached into her tote and handed me a chilled bottle before the waiter could respond. She said it was easier that way, no waiting. Later that evening, we dined again in the captain's lounge. It was candlelit and quiet, with a pianist playing something soft in the corner. Darren was animated, talking about his new business venture, some kind of crypto software I didn't understand. I smiled where I needed to, nodded when it seemed right. When dessert arrived, Liana reached for the teapot, claiming it was a new blend lavender and chamomile. She poured, slowly added a touch of honey, and pushed the cup gently toward me. I wrapped my hands around the ceramic. It was warm, familiar. But I didn't drink. Back in my cabin, the fog returned stronger than before. My heart stuttered against my ribs, and a sharp cramp passed through my stomach. I lay down on top of the covers, closed my eyes, and waited. The feeling passed after a while, but the unease stayed with me. I got up, walked to the mirror. My skin looked paler than usual, and my right hand trembled slightly when I tried to brush a strand of hair behind my ear. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing soft clicks in the hallway footsteps stopping just outside my door. Once, I thought someone knocked, but when I got up and opened the door, there was no one there. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But by the next morning, I knew better. The third night's dinner was quieter than the last. The tables were arranged in a soft semicircle around the piano, and most of the guests had grown friendly with one another. I kept to myself, hands folded on my lap, trying to ignore the low ache in my shoulders. Darren and Liana arrived late. She kissed me on the cheek and said I looked well rested. Darren rubbed his temples and muttered something about the ship's motion. The waiter offered wine, which I declined. Liana insisted I try her spritzer instead, something with pear and ginger. I let her pour it into my glass. The bubbles fizzed for a moment, then went flat. I lifted it, smiled, then set it aside. Midway through the meal, I excused myself to the restroom, needing space more than anything. The hallway was dim, lined with old newspaper clippings and photographs of the ship. As I walked back, something caught my attention. A young waitress, no more than 22, stood beside a cart folding napkins. Her eyes weren't on her hands. They were following Liana across the room. When I passed her, she looked straight at me, lips tight, eyes steady. I returned to my seat and noticed something unusual. Beneath the edge of my napkin was a small piece of paper, torn, hand-written, smudged. It read, "Call 911. There is something in your tea." My hands went cold. I tucked the note into my purse, folded the napkin over the plate, and kept my face still. I didn't touch the spritzer again. Darren was scrolling on his phone. Liana asked if I felt chilly and ordered me another tea without waiting for a reply. When the cup arrived, I recognized the smell before I even lifted it. Chamomile again, but beneath it, something else. Something faintly metallic, like rust or dried flowers left too long in water. I smiled, nodded, and didn't drink. Back in my cabin, I locked the door and sat beneath the reading lamp. I took the note from my purse and read it again slower this time. The words were rushed, almost panicked. My hands were trembling, not from age, but from what I now understood. I began replaying every dinner, every glass Liana poured, every moment Darren watched without really looking at me. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't paranoia. Something was happening, and someone had seen enough to warn me. That night, I sat up in bed with the lights off listening. I could hear the hum of the ship's engines, the occasional shuffle of feet in the hallway. Around midnight, there was a knock. Just once, then silence. I didn't move. Morning came slowly, and with it the nausea returned. But I got dressed, pinned on my brooch, smoothed my collar. I smiled at my reflection, then left the room like nothing had changed. At breakfast, I saw her again, the same waitress. She passed behind my chair, paused only for a second. As she poured coffee into the cup beside mine, she turned her wrist. Written in pen just near the base of her thumb was a local phone number. She didn't speak. She didn't glance back. But I saw it. And in that instant, I knew for sure. I wasn't imagining any of this. The morning after I saw that number inked on her hand, I didn't go to breakfast. I stayed in my room, wrapped in a cardigan, watching the fog slide over the surface of the water like slow breath. The note from the dining room was on the table beside me, folded and worn at the edges. I must have opened and closed it a dozen times during the night. I hadn't really slept. My eyes would shut for minutes at a time, but every creak in the hallway jolted me awake again. I kept trying to piece it all together, every cup of tea, every moment Darren insisted on walking me back to my room, every time Liana poured a drink without asking. I'd ignored so many small things, but now I couldn't afford to ignore anything. A few minutes before 10, I left my cabin and made my way down to the mid-deck cafe. I didn't want to go back to the main dining room. Too visible. Too many eyes. The cafe was quieter. Passengers kept to themselves, reading or checking their phones. I chose a corner table that faced the door. She arrived not long after. Same dark ponytail, same crisp apron. She carried a tray of pastries and moved through the room without drawing attention. Then as she reached the table nearest mine, she paused. She adjusted a napkin, cleared a few crumbs, and leaned in my direction just slightly. Her voice was low, fast. She told me she was in school for pharmacology. She said she'd seen Liana adding something to my cup twice. She hadn't meant to get involved, but after what she saw last night, she couldn't stay quiet. Then she slipped another note beneath my saucer and walked away. I didn't read it right away. I waited until I was back in my room with the door locked and the latch turned. The note was shorter this time. Just a word I didn't know, dioxin, and a warning it could mimic signs of heart failure in older adults. At the bottom was a suggestion: get blood work done as soon as possible. I read it twice, then set it down slowly. The name meant little to me at first, but the way it was written made my heart beat harder. I remembered one of the women in my book club once mentioned her grandson overdosing on a cardiac medication. I didn't remember the details, only that it had been fast, quiet. A few hours later, there was a knock on my door. It was Darren. He stepped in with that casual voice he used when he wanted something talked about: the breeze, the view, how I was enjoying the food. I nodded along. He said he and Liana had been thinking about long-term plans, that maybe it was time I started slowing down, maybe let go of the bookstore. He mentioned a condo in Florida, said they had already toured one, said it would be easier, safer. I smiled and told him I'd think about it. When he left, I locked the door and slid a chair underneath the knob. I knew it wouldn't stop anyone, but it gave me something to do with my hands. That evening, I opened my notebook and started writing things down. Every drink, every headache, every strange moment since we boarded. I listed the time, who was there, what I ate, what I felt after. I didn't write full sentences, just words, fragments minty light-headed off honey deoxin spritzer. The simple act of writing helped. I needed something solid, something that made it all feel real. After lunch the next day, I found another envelope pushed under my cabin door. It was unmarked. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a room number 212, a time midnight, and a number written beneath it. No explanation. No signature. I didn't know what I would find there, but something told me I had to go. That afternoon, I kept to myself. I walked the deck alone, keeping close to the railing, my coat zipped to my chin. The sea was calm, but I felt boxed in. On a ship, there's nowhere to go. You're always being watched, even when no one is looking. At lunch, Darren brought me a bowl of soup without asking. He joked that they were trying out retirement food early. Liana smiled a little too quickly and dabbed a napkin at the corner of my mouth. I thanked them both and didn't touch the bowl. I left before dessert. Back in my room, I double-checked the deadbolt and took out my notebook again. I drew a timeline marked symptoms and conversations, what I had seen in Liana's purse, what I'd heard Darren say. I didn't try to make it neat. I just needed to see the pattern. Around 11:30, I got dressed. I put on my coat, slipped the latest note in my pocket, and stepped out quietly. The hallway was quiet, but the ship groaned softly as it shifted through the water. When I reached room 212, I knocked twice, then once more. The door opened just a crack. It was the waitress. Her name tag read, Maris. She didn't say anything, just nodded and stepped aside. The room was dim. A single desk lamp lit the space. She handed me a manila envelope, then pointed to the bed where I could sit. Inside the envelope were 3 photographs. One showed Liana standing over a table, pouring something from a small brown bottle into a teacup. Another showed Darren holding a prescription bag outside a small pharmacy. The third was of my cabin door with a timestamp and the faint outline of someone crouched down, sliding something underneath. Maris said her friend in security had helped her access still frames from the ship's cameras. She knew she wasn't supposed to have them, but she said she'd seen enough. She told me she'd already sent copies to someone she trusted, just in case something happened to either of us. She pressed a small voice recorder into my hand, told me it might be safer than trying to make a call. Then she walked me back into the hallway and disappeared through a service door without another word. I didn't speak either. Back in my cabin, I didn't cry. I didn't sleep. I sat at the desk and stared at the photographs under the soft yellow glow of the lamp. The evidence was there, not imagined, not exaggerated, real. In my hands. The next morning, the water outside was still. From my window, I could see the breakfast deck below, guests clinking glasses and laughing over coffee. I didn't touch the tray that had been delivered to my room. I made a note of everything on it: scrambled eggs, melon slices, orange juice. I poured the juice down the sink and washed the glass twice. I kept Maris's envelope tucked close to me beneath my blouse. The recorder stayed in my left coat pocket. I checked it again and again, just to be sure it was working. I didn't know when I would need it, but I knew that moment was coming, and when it did, I would be ready. The ship docked just after 9 the next morning at a small harbor town I didn't recognize. The sun hadn't fully burned off the fog yet, and the dock looked quiet from my window, just a few shops, a small market, and couples stepping off the boat with sun hats and canvas bags. Darren knocked on my door around 10. He asked if I wanted to join him and Liana for a walk through town. I told him I was feeling tired. He offered to bring something back, asked if I needed anything in particular. I smiled and said a scarf or a book would be nice. 10 minutes after he left, I grabbed my cardigan and slipped the smaller note, Midnight Room 212, into my pocket. I didn't take the elevators. I used the side stairwell down past the guest cabins into the crew deck. Maris had written a second set of numbers inside the flap of her last note. A location I'd passed once near the laundry chute, bare metal doors, and a panel tucked behind a set of rolling carts. When I found it, I entered the code. The lock clicked open with a soft sound. Inside was a narrow cabinet no bigger than a school locker. At the bottom sat a prepaid phone and a folded sheet of paper. The note was brief, just a name, a phone number, and a lawyer's office based out of Baltimore. I placed both items in the inner pocket of my coat and returned to my cabin without seeing another soul. The silence in the room felt different, not peaceful, expectant. I pulled out my notebook and added everything I had learned. I sketched the layout of the cafe marked where Maris had stood. I noted the photos, the camera angles, what time the breakfast tray arrived that morning, and what was on it. Each page made the truth clearer, and the more I saw on paper, the more obvious it became. They weren't being sloppy. They thought I wasn't paying attention. Around 3 p.m, there was another knock. Liana stepped into the room with a gift bag in one hand and that practiced smile on her face. She said she'd found something for me at a shop in town, a silk scarf in soft cream and blue. She placed the bag on the desk, then sat across from me. Her tone was light. She asked if I was feeling better. I told her I was. She nodded and said she and Darren had been talking. They wanted to help me think ahead. She mentioned medical care, legal paperwork, even suggested it might be wise to begin transferring certain documents early. Said it would keep things simpler down the road. I said nothing. She reached into her tote and pulled out a manila envelope, then placed it on the table between us. She said they were just drafts, nothing binding, just something to look over before dinner. I promised I'd take a look later. She stood, told me to rest, then left without waiting for a reply. The envelope sat on the table untouched for hours. I didn't open it, not yet. I had no plans to sign anything, but I wanted to see what they had written. That evening, I dressed carefully, same cardigan, same necklace. I slipped the voice recorder into the side pocket. The photos and the earlier flash drive Maris had given me went into the bottom of my tote, and I added the envelope from Liana. If anything happened that night, I needed everything with me. Dinner was quieter than usual. A few passengers had stayed in town and hadn't made it back. Darren greeted me at the table with a glass of red wine already poured. I thanked him, placed the glass gently on the table, and didn't touch it. Liana arrived a few minutes later wearing a blush-colored blouse and her usual soft perfume. She apologized for being late, then smiled as the waiter brought the tea tray to the table. The cup he placed in front of me was delicate white porcelain with a thin gold rim. A small pot wrapped in a cloth napkin sat beside it. Liana's hand hovered over the handle, but she didn't pour right away. She was waiting. I folded my napkin into my lap and sat back. My hands didn't shake. Not anymore. Darren talked about an upcoming investment meeting. Said they might have to leave the cruise early depending on how things went. Liana added that it was a last-minute opportunity they couldn't ignore. I nodded, let them talk. Then I asked about the envelope, said I had seen the documents but hadn't had time to review them fully. Darren said they were just suggestions, estate planning, nothing final. Liana said it would help reduce stress for everyone, that they didn't want me to worry. I smiled, told them I appreciated it. Then I reached for the tea. I didn't drink. I only held it. When I got back to my room, I opened the envelope for the first time. Inside were multiple pages, some typed, some with sticky notes flagging where I'd need to sign. There was a draft of a power of attorney banking access forms and a short letter addressed to my attorney in Maryland. The letter said I'd chosen to consolidate my assets under Darren's care, that I was voluntarily transitioning responsibilities to him, that I wanted all correspondence to go through Liana from now on. I placed the documents back inside and slid the envelope beneath the lining of my suitcase. I didn't tear it. I didn't write on it. I just kept it. Later that night, near midnight, I returned to the crew deck. Maris met me near the service stairs again. This time, she was holding a flash drive. She said her friend in security had pulled a few short clips, not full footage, but enough. One showed Liana slipping something under my cabin door. Another showed Darren handing a note to a waiter, same size and fold as the ones I had found. There was also a still of Liana's purse, slightly open with a small brown bottle visible near the edge. I didn't ask for more. I took the flash drive, thanked her, and left. Back in my room, I tucked it into a spare toiletry bag beneath a pack of cotton pads and a travel toothbrush. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for the ship to go quiet. Outside, the sea was calm again, but the silence no longer felt like a comfort. It felt like the moment just before something breaks. The morning after I tucked the flash drive into my toiletry bag, the sky outside my cabin window was cloudless and bright. The sea stretched flat and calm, but inside me, everything had shifted. I wasn't guessing anymore. I had photographs. I had surveillance stills. I had a voice recorder in my coat pocket that clicked on with a quiet flick of my thumb. I didn't need to confront anyone. Not yet. What I needed was a room alock and someone who could file a report that would follow us back to shore. I dressed carefully, dark slacks, my navy blouse with sleeves long enough to hide the recorder. I packed my tote bag with everything Maris had given me, and I added something else. Liana's envelope still sealed with the original documents untouched. They didn't know I had kept it. They didn't know I planned to use it. Around mid-morning, I walked to the reception desk and asked if I could speak to someone from the legal or security staff. A young woman called down to the administrative hallway and led me to a small room tucked behind a corridor marked Staff Only. I waited there alone until a uniformed officer named Givens entered with a clipboard under his arm. He looked no older than 35, polite but cautious, like he wasn't sure what kind of problem he was about to hear. I laid the flash drive on the table, then the photographs. Then the notes, each folded cleanly, each one placed with care. I told him what had been happening since the second night. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't embellish. I said I believed my son and his wife had been slipping something into my drinks, that they had pushed legal papers across the table while pretending to care about my comfort, that I had not signed anything, that I had evidence. Givens didn't interrupt. He glanced once at the envelope with the forms Darren and Liana had prepared, then nodded and asked for permission to show the flash drive to the head of security. I told him yes. Before he left, he asked if I wanted the ship to contact my attorney. I gave him the name and number of Janice Porter in Maryland and told him to use the satellite line if necessary. He said he'd send the message right away. I didn't return to my cabin. I found a corner seat in the ship's library, settled in behind a tall stack of travel guides, and waited. By lunchtime, Darren found me. He said he'd been looking all over, asked if I'd join them for a bite up on the upper deck. I stood and followed him. The sun had grown stronger and the breeze had shifted, but I barely noticed. The table was already set when we arrived. Liana was there, pink lipstick perfectly applied, pouring iced tea from a glass carafe. She smiled, said they'd saved me the best seat. Her eyes flicked once toward my bag. We had just started the meal when a uniformed crew member approached. I hadn't seen him before. He leaned in and spoke to Darren in a tone I couldn't hear. Then he addressed Liana and asked if they could both come with him to speak briefly with the captain. Something about a routine passenger matter. Nothing urgent, just a few questions. Darren touched my shoulder lightly and said they'd be right back. I watched them walk across the deck toward the central stairwell. Neither of them looked over their shoulder. I didn't move. I sat quietly and sipped the iced tea I had poured myself. The breeze stirred the edge of the napkin in my lap, I folded it gently over my silverware. Givens found me a short while later and asked if we could speak again. This time, he led me into a colder room. Metal walls, a bolted-down table. He said the security officer and medical staff had reviewed the footage. They had confirmed the prescription bag, the moments Liana hovered too long over my teacup, and the suspicious timing of certain room deliveries. It wasn't proof beyond doubt, he said, but it was enough to require further review. Darren and Liana were being questioned separately. They weren't under arrest, but they'd been told to remain in their cabin until the ship reached its final port. He asked if I wanted to press charges. I told him not yet. First, I wanted to speak to my attorney. That evening dinner was different. I asked to sit alone. The table was set for one near the window. Maris passed by once, refilling glasses. She didn't say anything, just looked at me and gave a small nod. Back in my room, I finally slept. No engine noise could bother me, no footsteps outside the door. Just quiet, deep, steady sleep. But even then, I knew the story wasn't over. The ship docked at the final port just after sunrise. From the top deck, I watched passengers step off with rolling suitcases and souvenir bags. The sky was overcast, and the water reflected a dull gray that felt fitting. I stood alone near the railing in my windbreaker tote bag zipped at my side. Inside it were all the pieces, documents, photographs, flash drive, the recorder still holding every word from that dinner table. The night before, I had spoken to Janice. The call was brief, but her tone told me everything I needed. She'd received the message from the ship and reviewed the materials Officer Givens had forwarded. She confirmed what I suspected. Darren had called her office 2 weeks earlier, requesting a copy of my trust documents. He hadn't said I was sick. He said I was slipping. He wanted to know how quickly the trust could be amended if he had legal authority. I didn't respond to that part of the call. I didn't need to. At 10:30, I made my way to the main lounge where the cruise director was holding a farewell reception. Most people were there for the free mimosas and the last round of pictures. I had asked Officer Givens to arrange something else. Just 15 minutes, a small request to address the room before we disembarked. Not dramatic. Just a quiet gesture before leaving. The microphone felt lighter than I expected. I stood at the front of the room, palms dry, voice steady. I thanked the staff first. Then I spoke about how a person's true nature isn't shown in loud declarations, but in how they move when no one's watching. I said sometimes the quietest people carry the most courage. I didn't name anyone. I didn't have to. Then I asked for Maris to come forward. There was a pause. She looked frozen behind the espresso station, unsure if she had heard me right. But then she stepped out from behind the counter, her hands at her sides, her shoulders just slightly tense. I smiled and handed her a small envelope. Inside was a scholarship certificate. A real one. What she didn't know was that I had reached out 2 nights earlier to a small foundation Richard and I had supported for years. They specialized in funding women in healthcare and science. I told them about Maris. They made an exception for late cycle submissions. The scholarship would cover her final year of tuition and housing. Maris didn't say much. She took the envelope and hugged me quickly. Her hands trembled. Then she stepped back and returned to her post without a word. The room offered a polite round of applause, not sure exactly what they'd witnessed. But I wasn't watching the guests. I was watching Darren and Liana. They stood near the back wall, arms crossed, faces still. Darren's mouth was pressed into a thin line. Liana held her purse tightly under her arm. They didn't speak. They didn't move. That afternoon, before the ship pulled out again, I met with Officer Givens one last time. I gave him the originals, the documents, the photos, the voice recordings. I told him I wouldn't be pressing charges yet, but I wanted everything filed. I handed him a sealed envelope addressed to Janice and asked that it be mailed from the port with a signed receipt. He agreed. Then I handed him one final letter. It was for Darren and Liana. I didn't plan to give it to them myself. I didn't need to say anything more. My silence was enough. That night, I stayed in a small inn not far from the water. No motion beneath my feet. No quiet knocks outside the door. Just stillness. I sat at the bedside table and pulled out my notebook. I tore out every page that mentioned their names. I folded them once, then again, and placed them in the drawer. I didn't burn them, but I didn't keep them either. 3 weeks after I stepped off the ship, I sat once again in Janice's office. The same office where Richard and I had signed our wills decades ago, long before the bookstore or the heart monitor or the cruise that changed everything. The sun came through the tall windows in quiet rectangles, catching the dust in the air. Janice slid a fresh stack of documents across the desk. She spoke plainly. Everything had been rewritten. Darren and Liana's names no longer appeared in any part of my estate. Not on the deed to the house. Not in the trust Richard and I had set aside for literacy programs. Not even in the healthcare proxy. The bookstore would pass into the hands of a local community foundation after I was gone. They would keep it open, keep the readings, keep the shelves just as they were scattered with poetry and creaky floorboards. I initialed every page with a steady hand. Janice asked if I wanted her to file a police report with the additional evidence. I said no. Not yet. Before I left her office, I gave her everything I had kept: photographs, audio files, signed, and dated documents, all organized and marked. I told her I didn't want to live my life preparing for a courtroom, but I did want it all preserved in case it was ever needed. She nodded and placed the folder in her locked cabinet without another word. That afternoon, I stopped by the bookstore, not to work, just to sit. Cora was there, already arranging the summer reading table and pinning up flyers for a local author event. She waved when she saw me. I waved back and settled into the corner armchair near the poetry section, the same one Richard used to tease me about, claiming it had conformed to the shape of my spine over the years. A woman walked in a few minutes later. Mid-50s, quiet, holding a worn tote. She bought a memoir, then paused before leaving. She looked at me for a long moment, then said she had been on the same cruise. She remembered the way I stood at the front of the lounge during the farewell reception. She didn't ask questions. She just placed a hand over her chest and said she hadn't forgotten it. Then she left. That evening, I made a pot of mint tea. The real kind. No syrup, no sweetener, just steeped leaves and hot water in a ceramic mug. I sat at the kitchen table wrapped in the quilt from our first anniversary trip. It was quiet, still. I had changed the locks the morning after I returned. Hired a company to install cameras around the house. Nothing dramatic, just enough to sleep through the night. Some nights I still woke around 3. My body seemed to remember. I would lie in bed, heart calm, listening to the stillness. It was never the fear that got to me. It was the memory of how close it had come. Darren left a voicemail the day after the cruise ended. His voice was low-measured. He said he was sorry if things had felt confusing, that he and Liana only wanted what was best, that they hoped I'd understand in time. I didn't listen twice. I deleted it and never replied. In the back of my closet, under a bin of old scarves, I keep one file folder marked with the cruise line's name. Inside is a printed copy of the passenger manifest. My name is circled. Beneath it, I wrote one sentence in pen. You survived. You remembered. You rebuilt. And still, you are here. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it softened everything. Cora moved the poetry shelf closer to the window, and by early morning, the smell of old paper and sunlight filled the store. I started walking again, not for health, not for routine, but just to feel my shoes on the sidewalk, to notice the flowers that bloomed in the same order every year. On one of those mornings, I passed the cafe Richard and I used to visit. They'd changed owners twice, but the striped awning was the same. Later that week, a heavy envelope arrived in the mail. The return address belonged to Darren and Liana's attorney. Inside was a polished letter. Vague, measured. They intended to challenge the trust revisions. Their claim undue influence. That perhaps I had been manipulated during the trip. That someone had pressured me into rewriting my documents. It wasn't direct. But it was clear. I didn't panic. I called Janice. She let out a short breath, the kind that came from years of this kind of nonsense. She reminded me that we had everything time-stamped files, testimony photos, recordings. She said the law was on our side. Still, I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was afraid. Some griefs return without warning, even after you've buried them. That night, I sat at the table again, notebook open. For the first time since coming home, I started a new page. I didn't write about what happened. I didn't list symptoms or plans. I wrote about a choice. One moment. The second, I decided not to lift the teacup. The moment I walked into the security office with a bag full of quiet proof. The moment I saw Maris step back behind the coffee cart, her chin a little higher. These are the moments I chose to keep. Summer drifted in, slow and gentle that year. With Darren and Liana gone from every part of my life, the house felt quieter, but not empty. I spent more time at the bookstore working alongside Cora to sort new arrivals, dust old shelves, and plan the next poetry night. Maris wrote from campus every month or so, updating me on her classes and the research she'd started in the lab. She ended every note with something simple, just a thank you, or a line about how she was learning to trust her instincts, even in the smallest moments. The legal letters from Darren and Liana's attorney stopped after Janice sent her final response. No more threats, no more claims. I placed their last letter in a folder marked final, but I never felt the need to open it again. It felt like the closing of a heavy door. As the days grew shorter and the leaves began to turn, I realized I was starting to build a new rhythm for myself. I donated half the contents of my house and kept only what truly mattered. I painted the kitchen a pale yellow, replaced the family portrait above the fireplace with a favorite quote copied in my own hand: I am not what was done to me. I am what I chose to do after. Each morning, I found comfort in simple routines: tea in the sunroom, a walk through the neighborhood, pausing to listen to the sound of distant church bells, or children laughing on their way to school. I let go of setting the table for 3. Let go of the habit of waiting for someone to come home who never would. Sometimes I wondered if Darren and Liana thought about what they'd done, or if regret ever found its way into the spaces between them. But that wasn't my burden to carry. Instead, I chose to remember the moment I decided not to drink from the cup handed to me, the moment I recognized my own quiet strength, even as the world tried to convince me I had none left. With time, the old ache faded and was replaced by something steadier. Not happiness exactly, but the peace that comes from surviving what you thought would break you. I came to believe that sometimes justice isn't loud or quick. Sometimes it's the quiet act of reclaiming your own story, the gentle courage to keep living as yourself, even when you've been betrayed. So, if you find yourself doubting your worth or struggling to trust your own instincts, I hope you'll remember this. Resilience grows in small, steady ways. You outlive the poison, and one day you realize you're living like you never drank it at all. If my story meant something to you, I'd love for you to share your own thoughts in the comments, or just let someone know they're not alone tonight. Take gentle care, and thank you for listening.